The 8,843rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is peace and security in Africa. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ethiopia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and would like to give him the floor. The floor is yours, Excellency.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting on the situation in Ethiopia, a matter that is increasingly preoccupying the African continent and the wider international community. A military confrontation, which started some 10 months ago in the northern region of Tigray, is spreading, and the level of human suffering is growing, with serious political, economic, and humanitarian implications for Ethiopia and the broader region. All parties must recognize a simple truth: there is no military solution. Last week, I issued an appeal for action on 3 fronts. First, calling on all parties to immediately cease hostilities. Second, ensuring a commitment for unrestricted humanitarian access everywhere and fully reestablishing of public services. Third, creating the conditions for the start of an Ethiopian-led political dialogue to find a solution to this crisis. These steps are essential for 2 critical reasons. First, the unity of Ethiopia and the stability of the region are at stake, and they are very important. The military front lines in Tigray have now reached the regions of Amara and Afar. The declaration of a unilateral ceasefire by the government of Ethiopia on the 28th of June and the withdrawal of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces from Mekelle did not lead to a comprehensive ceasefire. The Tigray region remains largely under a de facto humanitarian blockade and cut off from key public services such as electricity and communications. Tigrayan forces have since expanded their presence into neighboring Amara and Afar regions, where fighting has escalated. Other actors in Ethiopia have entered the fight through mass mobilization and the activation of regional armed groups. Inflammatory rhetoric and ethnic profiling are tearing apart the social fabric of the country. The wider region is already witnessing the political, economic, and social impact of the conflict beyond the borders of Ethiopia. Second, the human price of this war is mounting by the day. A humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding before our eyes. More than 2 million people have been displaced from their homes, and 1 million more are in immediate need of life-saving humanitarian assistance, including food, water, shelter, and health care. At least 400,000 people are living in famine-like conditions. Last month, UNICEF warned that 100,000 children face life-threatening severe acute malnutrition over the next 12 months. Refugee camps have been destroyed. Healthcare systems have been decimated, with hospitals and clinics attacked and looted. And this has all been exacerbated by electricity and communications blackouts. I'm also deeply concerned by reports of horrific sexual and gender-based violence from survivors, including women and children. I condemn these atrocity acts in the strongest possible terms. This is compounded by other serious allegations of human rights violations and abuses against civilians reportedly perpetrated by all parties to the conflict. There must be accountability. A joint investigation by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is concluding. Mr. President, the United Nations and its humanitarian partners have mobilized to reach more than 5 million people with food or other essentials. But the capacity to respond is severely constrained by insecurity, delays, and a host of restrictions on the work of humanitarian organizations. Overland access into Tigray now depends on a single route through the Afar region, which involves passing through numerous checkpoints. Humanitarian organizations require roughly 100 trucks worth of assistance and supplies to reach Mekelle every day. Yes, since mid-July, an average of less than 10 trucks per day have been able to get through, and no trucks have arrived for over a week, while food warehouses are now empty. Sadly, humanitarian workers have been harassed and even killed. Well beyond Tigray, the conflict in Afar and Amhara regions has displaced reportedly 300,000 more people. This is taking place alongside efforts to maintain broader humanitarian support across Ethiopia in response to intercommunal violence, flooding, locust infestation, and other challenges. The conflict is also taking a heavy economic toll, illustrating once again the utter folly of war. The fighting has already drained over $1 billion from the country's coffers. Debt is mounting, access to credit is drying up. Inflation is growing higher, and basic food items are running low. Meanwhile, Ethiopia is suffering from the 5th highest incidence of COVID cases on the continent. Mr. President, Excellencies, for all these reasons, I repeat my fundamental call. All parties must immediately end hostilities without preconditions and seize that opportunity to negotiate a lasting ceasefire. Foreign forces should leave the country. Unrestricted humanitarian access to all areas in need must be guaranteed, and humanitarian workers must be respected. Public services must be re-established. I believe there is an opportunity to address the conflict peacefully, which the parties must seize in the interest of Ethiopia. And conditions must be created for the start of an inclusive national political dialogue to address the underlying causes of the conflict and ensure Ethiopian voices direct the pathway to peace. On these issues, I've been in contact with Prime Minister Abiy, and I also have received a letter from the president of the Tigray region, as it was elected at the time, in response to my appeal, which was also addressed to the President of the Security Council on this matter. The UN is ready to work together with the African Union and other key partners to support such a dialogue. In the period ahead, the attention and unity of the Security Council will be critical. Mr. President, allow me to express one final word of profound regret about the tragic events unfolding in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country full of promise, driven in large measure by the energy and the initiative of its youth. It's heartbreaking to see many young Ethiopians being instrumentalized and mobilized in the war effort. Their energies are being channeled into a path of division and destruction instead of the path of building a better future for all Ethiopians. They will be the ultimate casualties in this needless conflict. In every sense, the future of Ethiopia is at stake. Let us pledge to do all we can to advance the path of national cohesion and peace, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to preface my remarks, if I may, by offering my sincere condolences to the victims of the horrific attack today in Kabul. Our sincere condolences to the victims, all victims and their families. I want to thank you, Mr. President, for convening the meeting today, and thank you, importantly, Secretary General, for your insightful, yet, I must admit, deeply troubling briefing today. Thank you, Ambassador Tai, our colleague. It is critical that you're with us today. Mr. President, in the last 9 months, we have witnessed a severe and deepening political crisis in Tigray, which is now expanding to neighbouring regions of Ethiopia. The immediate consequences has been a massive humanitarian emergency, with more than 5.2 million people in need of assistance in Tigray alone. We deeply regret that it has come to this. We were warned months ago. We spoke of the risks here at this same table. Sadly now, if the crisis is not urgently addressed, the longer-term consequences for the unity of Ethiopia and the stability of the wider region are potentially catastrophic. This is why Ireland has continually raised this unfolding crisis as a matter of the deepest concern. Your presence, Secretary General, and your clear messages today underscore just how serious the situation has now become. Secretary-General, I want to strongly echo what you call the simple truth, that there is no military solution to this conflict. We agree with you that regional partners, and in particular the African Union, have a crucial role to play in finding the political solution needed to end this crisis. We have been underlining this message since we joined the Council, and I was pleased to see today that the former Nigerian President Obasanjo was appointed by the African Union as the High Representative for the Horn of Africa. We welcome this. Mr. President, no one in this chamber underestimates the complexity of this crisis. We certainly don't. But that is not an excuse to stand by. Today, we have heard from the Secretary-General about where we might start. Today, all Council members have an opportunity to support the Secretary-General and those caught in this crisis by sending 3 clear and united messages. First, all parties to the conflict must cease immediately hostilities, come to the table to negotiate a lasting ceasefire. Second, all parties to the conflict must ensure full, unimpeded and safe humanitarian access, as well as the restoration of public services. And third, conditions must be created to allow for dialogue and to find a solution to the conflict in Tigray, while a broad range of stakeholders must engage in a process of inclusive dialogue to address the significant challenges affecting Ethiopia. The international community, that means us, we must stand ready to support this process. Mr. President, the shocking spectre of famine continues to loom. We know that millions of people are displaced and hundreds of thousands are already starving. There is absolutely no time to waste. This is not a time for reflection. On the contrary, it's a time for action. The sad reality is that without further, immediate and scaled-up action, the horror of starvation will overwhelm parts of Ethiopia again, with harrowing echoes of past tragedy. Too many ordinary men, women and children will suffer. Too many will die as collateral damage in a war not of their making. As we've just heard in clear terms, their basic humanitarian needs to food and shelter are not even close to being met. I repeat, this is a time for action. As humanitarian workers continue to face violence and unnecessary obstacles in carrying out their work, we say it's past time to act. Mr. President, we call again on the Ethiopian authorities and all other actors to immediately facilitate full, unimpeded humanitarian access. We also urge the government of Ethiopia to restore basic public services for the people of Tigray. Access to food, medical services and education are the very least that the people deserve. The human dignity and human rights of millions are at stake. We also call on the Tigrayan forces to immediately end their military offensive and withdraw from the Amhara and Afar regions. The longer the conflict persists, the greater the suffering of all Ethiopian people. We've taken careful note of the letter referenced by the Secretary-General sent by the Tigrayan representatives, which may be an important development. We further call on the Amhara forces to withdraw from Western Tigray. I also echo the call of our African colleagues for external forces to withdraw from Ethiopia. Mr. President, we are horrified by the conflict-related sexual violence and atrocities that have defined this conflict. It's clear that women and girls have been systematically raped and abused throughout the conflict. Communities have been traumatized. Those responsible for all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law must be held to account. This is true not least because countering impunity is essential to preventing further violations. We await the findings of the report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. We hope that work will draw to a conclusion without undue delay. We also call on all parties to refrain from using inflammatory rhetoric and dehumanizing language, which serves only to fuel ethnic and political tensions across Ethiopia. Such dehumanizing rhetoric is never acceptable. As history tells us, nothing good can come of this. Mr. President, I began today by saying that this Council has an opportunity and a responsibility to send a clear and united message. Let me come back to that. We need a cessation of hostilities and for the parties to come to the table to negotiate a lasting ceasefire. We need unimpeded humanitarian access, and we need a political solution to the crisis in Tigray and an inclusive national dialogue. Leadership to forge a path towards peace must be found among the parties to this conflict. Time is of the essence. The very lives of Ethiopian people are at stake. Now is the time for action. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I thank the Secretary General Guterres for being with us today and the remarks you made. Estonia welcomes today's very timely Council meeting and reiterates the need to keep the situation in Tigray on the Council's agenda. We are deeply worried about the escalating conflict in Tigray, which is aggravating an already dire humanitarian situation and increasingly threatening the wider stability of the region. The reports of growing civilian casualties, especially among children, are alarming. It is essential that all parties adhere to the international humanitarian law and do their utmost to protect civilians. It must be acknowledged by all that there can be no military solution to this conflict. We join the Secretary General in calling upon the parties to cease hostilities as an immediate priority and to start negotiations for a permanent ceasefire. We call upon the Tigray forces to stop their offensive, in particular in neighboring Amhara and Afar regions, which has already caused massive displacement and will only expand the devastation and suffering. At the same time, we call upon the government of Ethiopia to request the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Tigray, to ensure unfettered humanitarian access to the region, and to restore basic services, including water, fuel, electricity, communications, and banking in all areas affected by the conflict. We also urge the government to facilitate the challenges faced on the ground by humanitarian aid organizations in order for them to be able to assist those in need. Estonia is increasingly concerned about the conflict-driven food security crisis, which has been deteriorating mainly due to the interruption of supply lines. Around 400,000 people are already living in famine, the worst level of acute food insecurity, with 4 million people approaching the same. Mr. President, continued reports about violations and abuses of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including widespread sexual and gender-based violence, are deeply worrying. In this context, we reiterate the importance of the ongoing joint investigation by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. The perpetrators must be held accountable and brought to justice. We are also worried about reports of arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances of ethnic Tigrayans in Addis Ababa. We call upon the Ethiopian authorities to investigate these possibly unlawful and discriminatory practices. To conclude, the people of Ethiopia have suffered enough. While the immediate priority must be ending the hostilities, this should be followed by an inclusive and credible political process with the aim of national reconciliation. The conflict in Tigray can only be solved through dialogue. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, President. I also would like to echo my colleagues today to extend my condolences to the victims of the terrible attacks that happened today in Kabul, as well as their families. I'd like to thank the Secretary General for his briefing. On my side, I'll make 5 points. While this conflict has now lasting almost 10 months, we must look at the reality. Our priority and the responsibility of the Security Council are to put an end to this conflict and preserve the unity of Ethiopia. We will only manage to do this if all forces present play their part. This This is a conflict, as we know, with several parties, the federal government, militia and special regional forces, as well as their Eritrean allies on the one side and Tigrayan forces on the other. Calling for a cessation of hostilities, humanitarian access and dialogue does not imply any bias. It is clear that this conflict will not be solved by weapons. As you've said so clearly, Mr. Secretary-General, all parties must agree on a ceasefire. We'd also call for a definitive withdrawal of Eritrean forces from Ethiopian territory. We call on Tigrayan forces to reinstate the regional borders in Tigray to avoid any escalation. A compromise must be finally reached with the Amhara forces on the border dispute between the two regions, as within the framework of the constitution. Attacks against civilians, extrajudiciary executions, forced expulsions, sexual violence, or violence motivated by ethnic origin or supposed political affiliation of people should not go unpunished, whoever their perpetrators may be. Here, France reiterates its full support to the joint inquiry on violations of human rights, which must allow the facts to be established, and indisputably so. These conclusions must be followed up upon. We also regret the difficulties faced in the collection of evidence, and we call on all parties to guarantee access for investigators. A ceasefire is indispensable to address the humanitarian emergency. France calls on the Ethiopian government to respect the commitments that they have taken upon themselves to guarantee humanitarian access. A priority of overcoming obstacles for aid delivery through all tracks, including by road, is a priority. It is also up to the authorities to reconnect electricity, telecommunication, internet services and the banking system. France is also concerned by attempts to discreditate humanitarian workers and condemns all violence and intimidation against humanitarian and medical personnel. Finally, it is urgent to establish the conditions for a dialogue and reconciliation process. Here we call once again on all of the parties to shoulder their responsibilities. The swift launching by the federal government of a national dialogue with representatives of all forces within society is essential so that we can find a political solution to the divisions within Ethiopia and preserve its unity. We call at the same time on representatives of Tigray to demonstrate that they are open to dialogue too. France finally supports regional efforts for peace. We welcome in this connection the appointment of the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, as High Representative of the African Union for the Horn of Africa. We call on countries of the region to solve their disputes through sincere dialogue, particularly as regards the El Fashaga Triangle and the Renaissance Dam. We call on all parties to refrain from all action that would stoke tensions and to respond in a constructive fashion to the mediation efforts of the African Union. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, President. With the sadness and disbelief, we are yet again discussing the prospect of a man-made famine in Tigray. The expansion of the armed conflict into the neighboring regions of Afar and Amhara will only increase the suffering. The ramifications for the entire country are grave and potentially undermine regional peace and security in the Horn of Africa. President, let me thank the Secretary General for his frank briefing. We are grateful for your tireless diplomatic efforts to bring an end to this conflict. We hope to see that your leadership in preventive diplomacy is replicated by other key actors, such as regional institutions. As we have been told, the humanitarian consequences of the conflict in Tigray are massive. To end the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Tigray, some immediate actions are crucial. First, the federal Ethiopian authorities and all other actors must secure rapid, safe, and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid to the region. Second, all parties must do their utmost to facilitate the work of humanitarian organizations and their personnel. And third, all parties must fully respect international humanitarian law and provide security for humanitarian workers. Repeated assurances from Ethiopian authorities of compliance with its humanitarian obligations have failed to materialize. In reality, Tigray is placed under a strict closure regime. The provision of humanitarian aid through land convoys and air access is being obstructed instead of facilitated. We strongly condemn the many vilifying comments made in public regarding humanitarian actors and workers. Such hateful rhetoric is creating more insecurity and putting the lives of humanitarians at risk. President, it is incumbent on all parties to protect the human rights of all people. This includes protection from stigmatization or ethnic profiling. We are deeply concerned by allegations of serious human rights violations and abuses in Tigray and other conflict-affected areas, including against children. Norway condemns in the strongest possible terms the reported killings of civilians and the widespread and systematic use of sexual and gender-based violence. Additionally, the reported systematic destruction of vital infrastructure and health centers is equally unacceptable. These must be rapidly restored. The alleged atrocities, violations, and abuses of international human rights and international humanitarian law must be documented and investigated, and those responsible must be prosecuted. Bringing perpetrators to justice is critical for prevention and deterrence. We welcome the joint investigation by OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, as well as the African Commission on Human Rights and People Rights Independent Commission of Inquiry, into the alleged atrocities in Tigray. We expect that all findings are used to ensure accountability. Norway will continue to make sure the fight against impunity remains high on the Council's agenda. President, Norway urges all actors in the conflict to immediately end the violence and enter into dialogue. To facilitate this, Eritrea must fully withdraw from Ethiopian territory. Tigrayan forces must end their expansion into neighboring regions, and Amhara federal forces and militia must withdraw from western Tigray. Finally, President, it is vital that the states in the region, IGAD and the African Union, bring its full weight to end hostilities in Tigray and Ethiopia. And we recognize the effort thus far by Prime Minister Hamdok in his capacity as chair of IGAD, and we welcome today's appointment of former President Obasanjo as AU's High Representative for the Horn of Africa. Likewise, this Council must lend all possible support to these regional efforts. We should speak with one voice, calling for cessation of hostilities, unimpeded humanitarian access, and a peaceful resolution through dialogue. And the Council should receive regular reporting on humanitarian access to Tigray, including clear indicators of any gaps in the response and assistance needed. We cannot allow the humanitarian situation in Tigray to deteriorate even further into catastrophe, or the conflict in Ethiopia to destabilize the Horn of Africa without pursuing all available avenues towards a political solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also offer the UK's condolences for all those who lost their lives in today's terrorist attack in Kabul. I thank the Secretary-General for his briefing. You describe a desperate situation, and it is right that this Council considers how it can help. So I would like to make 3 points in response to what we've heard. First, all parties must cease hostilities, and unfettered humanitarian access must be provided to relieve the toll of this conflict on ordinary Ethiopians. As the Secretary-General told us, over 400,000 people in Tigray are experiencing famine conditions. That is more than the rest of the world combined. Only a fraction of the 100 trucks of aid required every day are getting into Tigray. Banking, electricity, and communication services remain suspended, posing serious obstacles to humanitarian operations. The spread of fighting into neighboring Amhara and Afar states, displacing tens of thousands of civilians, will only extend the human suffering and prolong the conflict. We therefore call on Tigrayan forces to immediately cease fighting in Amhara and Afar. We reiterate that Eritrean troops must withdraw completely from Ethiopia as the government of Ethiopia has requested. And we call upon the Ethiopian government to fully enable humanitarian access. That includes removing bureaucratic barriers to aid delivery and allowing sufficient cash and fuel into Tigray to enable humanitarian operations. Secondly, Mr. President, I want to emphasize the need for all parties to ensure the protection of civilians and to comply with international humanitarian and human rights law. The Secretary-General's briefing gave further weight to the reports we've been receiving of atrocities by all sides. These include brutal and systematic sexual violence, massacres, and the indiscriminate shelling of towns. We have also witnessed an increase in hate speech and attacks on the humanitarian community. The United Kingdom fully supports the joint investigation by the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. It is crucial to prospects for peace and reconciliation that this investigation is thorough and robust, and perpetrators of atrocities must be held to account. Thirdly, Mr. President, let me underline the urgency of pursuing political dialogue to end this crisis. The United Kingdom is a long-standing friend and partner of Ethiopia. We have been proud to work alongside Ethiopians to support their progress in reducing poverty and building sustainable economic growth. This conflict is already reversing that progress. It now threatens the long-term stability and prosperity of the country and of the region. We want to see Ethiopia return to a positive trajectory. 10 months in, it is clear there is no military solution to this conflict. The only way that Ethiopia can return to peace and prosperity is through an inclusive political settlement. That requires talks between the parties, urgently and without preconditions. We support the efforts by the Secretary-General, Under Secretary-General Griffiths, and by the African Union to make this possible. And we therefore welcome the announcement today of the appointment of former President Obasanjo as AU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. Mr. President, it is abundantly clear what the parties need to do now to end the dreadful toll of human suffering in Ethiopia. The United Kingdom joins the Secretary-General and other members of this Council in calling on all parties to cease hostilities, allow unfettered humanitarian access, comply with international law, and begin a process of dialogue to resolve the conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me begin by thanking those that have offered condolences to the victims of the evil and cruel terrorist act this morning at Kabul airport. It is much appreciated. And thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your insightful and, as my Irish colleague said, however, disturbing briefing today. In our last session on Ethiopia and the situation in Tigray on July 2nd, the United States, Ireland, and the United Kingdom called for public discussion in the Council focused on protection of civilians. We called then for a negotiated ceasefire and unfettered humanitarian access. And we called more broadly for a national political dialogue that would be inclusive of all Ethiopians. Since then, no progress has been made on any of these fronts, none. As we have heard from the Secretary General, the military confrontation has escalated. The Ethiopian government has not responded positively to proposals for negotiations. Instead, it has publicly called for the mobilization of militia. The TPLF, meanwhile, has expanded its own military campaign into the Afar and Amhara regions. Ongoing TPLF military operations in these regions are displacing hundreds of thousands of civilians, and this too must stop immediately. Eritrean defense forces have re-entered Tigray, and reports indicate that military alliances among armed groups and other regions risk sparking a wider war in Ethiopia. And instead of striving to create space for negotiations and for dialogue, leaders on all sides have used inflammatory rhetoric that is increasing polarization along ethnic lines. This is all gravely concerning to all of us. These developments are eroding the unity, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of the Ethiopian state. The United States is particularly concerned by reports of ongoing violence in the Tigray region and other parts of northern Ethiopia, including attacks against women and children. The Ethiopian government and the TPLF, as well as associated regional militias, must end the fighting now, allow humanitarian access, and move toward a negotiated ceasefire immediately and without preconditions. Eritrean Defense Forces, meanwhile, must refrain from further increasing or regionalizing the conflict. Today, I would like to focus on these three concerns: the dire humanitarian situation, the need for immediate negotiations toward a sustainable ceasefire, and the withdrawal of Eritrean forces. First, contrary to its public commitments, the Ethiopian government and regional authorities continue to cut off Tigray with limited entry of humanitarian goods or personnel. This withholding of humanitarian aid, particularly food, is leading to unnecessary death and untold human suffering. Last week, after repeated warnings, aid agencies ran out of food stocks in their warehouses in Tigray. This comes after all of us were told over the last 3 months about famine conditions in Tigray. Millions are at high risk of food insecurity in northern Ethiopia, and of those, hundreds of thousands are estimated to be at risk of starvation in Tigray. The heroes that are trying to fend off this starvation, the humanitarian workers, are, as we heard, being targeted and killed simply for providing aid to those who are in need. Despite a small increase in convoys and flights entering Tigray, we estimate that just 7% of the needed humanitarian supplies were able to reach Tigray over the past month. And that statistic is based on the World Food Programme's projection of what is needed and the Ethiopian government's own reporting on how many trucks have gotten through. And let's be clear, this shortage is not because food is unavailable. It is because the Ethiopian government is still limiting humanitarian aid and personnel, including land convoys and air access. We are troubled by disturbing reports that the Ethiopian government is intentionally withholding humanitarian assistance to starving Ethiopians, and these impediments to the movement of humanitarian supplies must be removed immediately, and trucks must be allowed to enter and deliver life-saving assistance to Tigray. If these impediments continue, large numbers of people will starve to death, and many more will die from disease. This council was very clear when we passed Resolution 2417 in 2018. The denial of humanitarian access and depriving civilians of objects indispensable to their survival is a violation of international humanitarian law and can constitute a war crime. Mr. President, council members, this is happening on our watch. The impediment to the movement of humanitarian supplies is not the only humanitarian crisis in the country. We are also alarmed by reports of reprehensible attacks against Eritrean refugees. One humanitarian worker was killed by TPLF forces in Amhara region last week, and humanitarians have observed the looting of NGO offices and warehouses by the TPLF, with the supplies being taken into Tigray. This is utterly unacceptable. These humanitarians are there to save lives. They must be protected. The trajectory of this conflict over the last 10 months demands continued Security Council action. Second, Mr. President, the United States remains deeply concerned about the role of Eritrea in fueling the ongoing crisis. The presence of the Eritrean Defense Forces in Ethiopia remains a significant barrier to ceasefire negotiations and to political resolution of the conflict. The evidence is overwhelming that Eritrean Defense Forces engaged in a pattern of serious human rights abuses in Tigray. So earlier this week, the United States designated the EDF's Chief of Staff Major General, pursuant to U.S. Executive Order 13818, which builds upon and implements the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. To avoid additional measures from the United States, the EDF must immediately and permanently withdraw from northern Ethiopia. And this leads to my final point. With all this suffering and this instability, it is clear that the fighting and abuses by all parties to the conflict must cease. Negotiations for a ceasefire and political discussion on a way forward must commence immediately. Given this magnitude of unspeakable suffering, the Security Council has come together, and I think we are making clear to all parties to this conflict, there is no military solution. I want to reiterate the Secretary General's call today for all parties to the conflict to halt offensives, come to the table without preconditions, and negotiate a lasting ceasefire. Without the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front's commitment to both unimpeded access and a negotiated ceasefire, the fighting will continue, more civilians will die. So the United States welcomes your personal engagement, Mr. Secretary General, and your leadership to initiate dialogue to a resolution of this conflict. To this end, we encourage you to work closely with the African Union and with regional and international partners with the full backing of this Council. Let me conclude by saying the United States is committed to supporting the people of Ethiopia and of the wider region as they work to resolve these challenges, as they work to overcome current divisions. The ties between the United States and Ethiopia are deep and historic. There is a reason Ethiopia is the largest recipient of U.S. humanitarian and development assistance in the world. We stand with Ethiopian people. They deserve to live in peace with each other and to lead healthier, more resilient, and prosperous lives. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for a statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to join other colleagues in expressing our deepest condolences to the family and governments of the victims, those who lost their life in the recent attack in Kabul. I would like to thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his insightful briefing, and I welcome the representative of Ethiopia to our meeting today. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Tigray, especially its consequences and adverse impacts on the daily life of millions of people since the last 3 months, has been of deep concern for all of us. This circumstance is made worse by a lack of constructive dialogue, negotiation, and reconciliation between the related parties, while tension has increased. The longer this situation lasts, the more likely it is that a long-term and comprehensive solution is out of reach at the expense of peace and development in Ethiopia. Against this background, we would like to stress the following point. First and foremost, the humanitarian situation in Tigray should be addressed in the most urgent manner. We welcome the Ethiopian government effort to improve the humanitarian access in the regions. This process should be accelerated. We also welcome the practical activity carried out by the United Nations, including humanitarian organizations and international and regional partners, for tens of thousands of Ethiopians over the past few months, including people in Tigray. We, however, understand that the access to and distribution of humanitarian assistance still remain far from satisfying the need of urgent assistance in many parts in Tigray. We call for safe, effective, and efficient delivery of humanitarian assistance and expanded access for the provision of much-needed assistance in Tigray region and bordering area. We support the appeal for action on 3 fronts stated and mentioned recently by the Secretary General. All the elements are crucial to find a way out for the current situation. Mr. President, violent killing against civilians, including women, children, and humanitarian workers, and the destruction of infrastructure indispensable to the civilian population in Tigray must be condemned and prevented. The perpetrator must be brought to justice. It is now important that all parties to comply with international law to protect civilians, including women, children, and thousands of Eritrean refugees currently trapped in the refugee camps in the Tigray regions. The current conflict, which has complicated political, historical, and ethnic roots, has exerted certain impacts on the regions. What needs to be done now is to stop fighting, start a dialogue, and start a political process. We hope that all relevant parties will refrain from all acts that might send Ethiopia into chaos and jeopardize peace and security in the country and in the regions. The Ethiopian authority and all other concerned parties should give the highest priority to the interests of its people, following the basic principle enshrined in the international law and the UN Charter. In this process, the international community, including the Security Council, should support all efforts toward this end, with full respect for the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. The principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of state and settlement of dispute by peaceful means should also be constantly upheld. Mr. President, last but not least, we would like to once again express our support for a constructive engagement of neighboring countries and international and regional organizations, especially EU and IGAD, for the process of peace, security, national reconciliation, unity, and development in Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation. You have the floor, please.
At the beginning of my statement, I can't not echo the condolences towards all victims and casualties from the terrible terrorist attacks in Kabul. It is clear that it is ISIL that President, we'd like to thank the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for his assessments of the the developments in northern Ethiopia. We also welcome the participation in today's open briefing of the Permanent Representative of Ethiopia to the UN, Taye Selassie. The Russian Federation is carefully following the military and political developments in the region. We regret that the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire announced at the end of June by Addis Ababa was broken. Units from the Tigray People's Liberation Front continue fighting, establishing control over a series of regions, not only Tigray, but also in neighbouring regions of Afar and Amhara, previously untouched by conflict. Of particular concern are attempts made by Tigrayan forces to cut off humanitarian assistance routes, including their taking control of the strategic highway linking Ethiopia and Djibouti, which threatens to worsen an already complex humanitarian situation and increasing flows of refugees and IDPs. The humanitarian situation in the region remains indeed tough. At the same time, the federal government is continuing to make significant contributions towards alleviating it. We welcome the efforts of the Ethiopian authorities recently getting a humanitarian convoy from the World Food Programme through to Semera. We welcome also the creation in the region of an emergency coordination centre. We hope that its establishment will help implement the plan to send to Tigray 100 lorries carrying humanitarian assistance every day, and also resolving the situation of Eritrean refugees who are in particularly dire straits. We are convinced that in order to address this situation, it is necessary, first and foremost, to depoliticize the North Ethiopian humanitarian file. Providing humanitarian assistance in the context of the ongoing political standoff and the toxic media atmosphere has little chance of success. Nor can we agree with the bias in public focus in the work of humanitarians in Tigray. When providing humanitarian assistance, it's important to pay attention to other regions too, including Amhara, Oromia, and Somali, who also have significant humanitarian needs. These are linked to droughts, floods, plagues of locusts, and problems with planting crops. The basis of these efforts should remain UN General Assembly Resolution 46182 and the UN Guiding Principles on Humanitarian Assistance. We call on OCHA to pay particular attention to establishing privileged and constructive dialogue with the federal government. We fully support, Mr. Secretary General, the work that you've been doing to launch a political dialogue as soon as possible. We are convinced that this dialogue should be led by Ethiopians themselves, with the support, first and foremost, from the African community. Any potential external assistance should be done while fully respecting the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of the country. In June's elections in Ethiopia gave convincing proof that the federal authorities can unify the Ethiopian community. We are convinced that they can independently work towards normalizing the situation and generally put the country back on the right development trajectory. Our African partners and the international community should simply support these efforts of the Ethiopian government. We'd also note in this connection the appointment of the High Representative of the African Union and former President of Nigeria, Obasanjo. It's important to understand also that attempts to undermine the situation and also exert pressure on the democratically elected government of Ethiopia, including through adopting unilateral sanctions, will only further stoke the conflict. Equally, nor will the crisis be solved by discussing it at the Security Council. It would be more effective if each member of the Security Council made its own contribution to resolving the situation. The emphasis should be on quiet diplomacy and bilateral channels of privileged communication. The Russian Federation is ready to ensure this. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China. We have the floor, please.
Mr. President, I thank SG Guterres for his briefing and welcome the presence of Ambassador Ahmed, permanent representative of Ethiopia, to this meeting. At present, the situation in Ethiopia is facing many challenges. Maintaining peace and stability of the country and ensuring peaceful coexistence of all ethnic groups is not only in the common interests of the Ethiopian people, but also vital to peace and the security of the Horn of Africa. It is also the goal that the international community makes joint efforts for. We hope all parties in Ethiopia will resolve conflicts and differences through political dialogue, ease tensions, and avoid further escalation of conflicts, so as to create conditions for achieving peace and reconciliation. China welcomes the Ethiopian government's recent efforts in alleviating the situation in Tigray and neighboring areas. In the meantime, affected by conflicts, the humanitarian situation in some Ethiopian states has become increasingly grave, and humanitarian needs in states such as Amhara and Afar have increased. We hope all parties in Ethiopia will continue to make efforts to expand humanitarian access and ensure the timely delivery of humanitarian goods to its people. China has provided emergency food assistance to the Tigray region, and we call on the international community to step up humanitarian assistance. International humanitarian agencies, while carrying out their work, should uphold the guiding principles of the UN for humanitarian assistance and respect the sovereignty of Ethiopia. China firmly supports Ethiopia's efforts in safeguarding national sovereignty and unity, and will continue to support the Ethiopian people in achieving national peace, stability, development, and prosperity. We hope the international community will support the Ethiopian government in achieving a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire and effectively promoting national reconciliation. China opposes interference by external forces in Ethiopia's internal affairs in the name of human rights and humanitarianism. We support the AU and the regional countries to resolve African issues in the African way and welcome the appointment of the former ambassador of Nigeria, Obasanjo, as the High Representative for African Affairs of the AU. We hope the UN and AU will strengthen their collaboration and jointly play a constructive role in promoting reconciliation among all Ethiopian parties through dialogue. The unilateral sanctions imposed by individual country on Ethiopia are inconsistent with the international law and the basic norms of international relations. Instead of resolving conflicts, they will only interfere with the political settlement. China believes the Ethiopian government has the ability and wisdom to handle its internal affairs well, and firmly believes the Ethiopian people can overcome difficulties and tackle the current challenges. China stands ready to work along with the international community to support Ethiopia's commitment to national unity, restoration of stability, and achievement of development. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico. You have the floor, please.
President, thank you very much. I would like to start, as others have done, by expressing our deep condolences to the families of the victims who lost their lives in the attack recently in Kabul. Mexico would like to thank Ireland, the United States, Estonia, France, Norway, and the United Kingdom for convening this session. We also thank the Secretary-General for his frank briefing. Frank, whilst worrisome, and we thank him for his efforts and dedication to the situation in Ethiopia. We would also like to welcome the representative of Ethiopia. In just a few months, President, it will be a year since the beginning of the hostilities in Tigray. The conflict has left thousands of civilians dead, displaced around 2 million people, and hundreds of thousands more are facing famine. Over 90% of the population requires some level of humanitarian assistance. Against this backdrop, we are particularly disquieted over reports stating that clashes have extended to the Afar and Amhara regions, increasing the number of internally displaced and the need for additional assistance. Moreover, the conflict has involved other protagonists at both national and regional level. Ethiopia is a friendly country to Mexico, and we are bound by historic and fraternal links. Ethiopia has played a key role in the stability of the Horn of Africa for decades. As well as being the headquarters of the African Union, it's an important troop contributor to peacekeeping efforts. Therefore, a prolongation of the conflict would not only have disastrous consequences for millions of Ethiopians, but would also represent a high risk of destabilization for the region. Once again, Mexico reiterates its call upon all parties to the conflict for an immediate ceasefire. We also call for the withdrawal of all non-Ethiopian troops from Tigray, as well as of militias not from neighboring federal states. Mexico calls upon the Ethiopian authorities to guarantee the protection of their citizens, independently of their ethnic origin or political affiliations. Reports of sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls and serious violations against children must be investigated and those responsible brought to justice. We are eagerly awaiting the results of the joint investigation underway by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. President, Mexico welcomes the efforts of the United Nations and other humanitarian actors to deliver humanitarian assistance to Tigray. We regret the fact that humanitarian activities continue to face challenges, and in particular, the fact that humanitarian aid cannot reach certain regions. Interruptions in communications, fuel, and the banking system have repercussions on the abilities of the humanitarian community to provide assistance. We underscore the need to re-establish these services and to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access so as to avoid further deterioration in the already critical situation. A lack of access to food could result in a massive famine, as we have already heard here. Whilst the lack of basic services, medicines and medical supplies of an essential nature exacerbate the risk of transmissible preventable diseases. Moreover, Mexico strongly urges all parties to the conflict to respect the norms of international humanitarian and human rights laws. In particular, the protection of civilians and essential infrastructure, as well as humanitarian personnel. In this regard, we reiterate the need to investigate all attacks against civilians and humanitarian personnel so as to avoid impunity. President, To conclude, I would like to say that if one thing has been made abundantly clear during this period, it is that there is no military solution to the conflict in Ethiopia, and as we have heard from many delegations. In this regard, we recognise the regional efforts to mediate and seek a political solution. Mexico calls upon all parties to the conflict to put the well-being of millions of people ahead of their own interests, and to immediately initiate an inclusive dialogue with a view to beginning the process of national reconciliation and reconstruction. And that is why we welcome the appointment of the former Nigerian President Obasanjo as High Representative for the Corn of Africa to the African Union. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to make this statement on behalf of the African 3+1, namely Kenya, Niger, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Tunisia. I thank the Secretary General for his briefing on the latest developments in Ethiopia. We commend his engagement with Ethiopian leadership, the African Union, and regional leaders. We believe that his good offices can play an important role in facilitating a resolution of the current situation. We have heard the important information, insights, and concerns expressed by our fellow members of the Security Council. We indeed share similar points of view with many of them. The violence presently afflicting the people and country of Ethiopia is a product of conflicting views of the country's future. It has erupted and worsened because the country's conflict prevention and resolution tools have until now been inadequate to the task. The resolution to this crisis requires that we undertake a mediation of the deep divides as part of an Ethiopian-owned process supported by the available peace and security architecture and practices, especially those of the African Union. As the A3+1, we observe that on every side of the conflict, there is a growing perception of ethnic identity being the basis of conflict. The opposed sides give short shrift to each other's grievances and regard opposition to their own view as illegitimate. These opposed constituencies, reflecting the present political character of Ethiopia, are organized along ethnic lines. This makes them uniquely dangerous because they easily conflate political opposition to a struggle between ethnicities. We have witnessed with profound concern the resulting terrible harms that have befallen innocent civilians. And if the present course is not changed, we fear that it may get far worse. We have condemned and continue to condemn the violence against civilians, the killing of boys and men not in uniform, the destruction of civilian objects, the confrontations that have led to the blocking of humanitarian aid being delivered to desperate families. In particular, we register our strongest protest against the horrific human rights violations and acts of sexual violence perpetrated against girls and women. Our values as a continent, as captured with such gravity in the African Union's Constitutive Act, demand respect for the sanctity of human life and the condemnation and rejection of impunity. To put an end to this violence, our values must inspire and drive practical action. Mr. President, in our last statement on the 2nd of July, we welcomed the democratic aspirations of the Ethiopian people as expressed in their last elections. We return to this important moment for Ethiopia to argue that democracy, above all, is a mechanism for the resolution of serious political differences. The democratic mandate awarded by the millions of voters must include every Ethiopian citizen, even and perhaps especially in Tigray and other parts of the country where the vote was not held due to insecurity. The democratic mandate will only fulfill its potential and fundamental requirement by helping resolve the greatest differences in Ethiopia. Excellencies, fellow members of the Security Council, it is not easy to move from violent confrontation to the negotiating table. This was why on the 2nd of July, we recommended use of the mechanisms available in Africa's peace and security architecture, underpinned by our Constitutive Act. Foremost among those mechanisms, and one that is available to Ethiopia immediately, is the right of member states to request intervention from the Union in order to restore peace and security. We welcome the appointment by the chairperson of the African Union Commission of former President Olusegun Obasanjo as a High Representative of the Horn of Africa region. His mandate is to promote peace, security, and stability on behalf of the region. We urge all regional leaders and the broad international community to lend him every assistance, particularly as he supports a peace process in Ethiopia. That process must promote and protect human and people's rights. It must be clear in assuring the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ethiopia. It should be genuinely inclusive to promote unity, solidarity, cohesion, and cooperation among the peoples of Ethiopia and the Ethiopian state. To allow space for it, we therefore urge the government of Ethiopia to remove all legal, administrative, and security barriers to a political dialogue. No matter what has come to pass, the government needs to acknowledge the existence of legitimate grievances and to understand that they must be resolved peacefully. We must also pronounce our concern and caution about the rallying of the civilian population to the conflict. Though it may be intended to marshal the patriotic spirit of the people, it can lead to an uncontrollable spiral of violence and bloodshed. There are those who will take it to be an invitation to acts of collective punishment against civilians. This is the time for leadership to urge calm, to give confidence that the country has the ability to overcome even this greatest of challenges with its growing democratic instincts. To the armed actors in Tigray, the TPLF or the TDF, we urge the withdrawal from neighboring regions and a halt to the rallying of other armed actors. The further they advance outside Tigray, the greater the danger to the people on whose behalf they claim to be acting. Escalating political tensions in other parts of the country will not solve the crisis. It will only widen the divide. The TPLF must leave no doubts lingering that they will ever play any part in compromising the political independence and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, which all members of the African Union are obliged to defend. In addition, we recommend the spirit of the following steps to all Ethiopian leaders, understanding that they are not easy to implement. 1, make immediate announcements to all citizens and to all militia and armed units that the targeting of civilians, and particularly women, is unacceptable and must stop immediately. 2, deconflict military movements in Tigray, Afar, and Amhara to enable unfettered access to humanitarian aid before famine returns to any part of Ethiopia. It is important that lines of communication between military leaders be opened for this purpose. 3, announce a willingness to stop hostilities and to engage in ceasefire. 4, for the parliament just voted into office, peace cannot be made with a political movement that has been labeled as a terrorist group. Parliament should prepare to lift this designation to allow for direct contact and negotiation with armed actors opposing the government. 5, for the government tangibly demonstrate an embrace of the people of Tigray by resuming the provision of basic services to them. 6, accept the good offices of the African Union, the region, and the UN Secretary General as bridges to mediation and peace building. Mr. President, to this Security Council and the international community, we make the following recommendations. We call for the government of Eritrea to withdraw its forces from Ethiopia and embrace a role of peace building. We urge wealthy countries and organizations to provide adequate resources to the humanitarian campaigns in Ethiopia. 3, we call for the UN Development Program, the World Bank, the IMF, and all of Ethiopia's creditors to deliver an economic recovery package to implement the moment political mediation is underway. Number 4, we urge caution in the use of any unilateral coercive sanction measures that risk Ethiopia's economic collapse. Their use will only worsen the humanitarian crisis. To the African Union, we call for a re-energizing of the peace and security architecture. We have seen that its powerful capabilities contribute to resolving many conflict situations in the continent, and we believe they can be used in Ethiopia. Mr. President, allow us to conclude with a final caution. War is seductive. There are those who today in Ethiopia call for it to be given a chance. Such an attitude taps into a deep human desire for the clarity that enmity appears to offer. It promises simplicity instead of painful compromise, the annoying need to listen to the other, and the frustration that comes from trying to appreciate complexity. The Ethiopia of old inspired and rallied us Africans. It had challenges. It had known war and subjugation among and between its peoples, but its successful resistance to colonialism, racism, and fascism rallied our spirits. As Africans, we are conscious that this is our historical moment to recover our march to prosperity, peace, and independence from the actors who prefer us weak and divided. Ethiopia must not tap into its glorious history to solely grasp the grievances that lead to anger and hatred. Instead, Ethiopians must find in their past the prominent lessons of compromise, unity, and peace. We appeal to the leaders and people of Ethiopia to understand that they cannot break each other's spirits and succeed in building a united and prosperous country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement. I would like to make a statement in my capacity as the representative of India. I join others in thanking the Secretary General for his comprehensive briefing and insights into the issue. I welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ethiopia in today's meeting. Let me begin by strongly condemning the terrorist attack in Kabul today. We extend our heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims of this terrorist attack. Today's attacks reinforce the need for the world to stand unitedly against terrorism and all those who provide sanctuaries to terrorists. Today's meeting under the agenda item Peace and Security in Africa has been necessitated by the humanitarian situation in Tigray, which is witnessing continuing fighting between the Ethiopian Defense Forces and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. In recent weeks, the conflict has intensified and now been spread by one side, TPLF, to the neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. The conflict is having a severe impact on the civilian population, particularly women, children, and the elderly, and has resulted in the killing of innocent civilians, human rights violations, and use of child soldiers. The unilateral ceasefire announced by the government of Ethiopia in June 2021 was an important step aimed at improving the worsening humanitarian situation. Unfortunately, the opportunity provided by the ceasefire seems not to have been grasped, with the continuing aggression and belligerence of one side and spread of fighting beyond Tigray region. The humanitarian cost and suffering due to the conflict is unfortunately mounting. This development has a potential to destabilize the larger Horn of Africa region. In our view, today's meeting should strengthen efforts towards a ceasefire, which is the need of the hour. In this context, we take note of the efforts of the government of Ethiopia and its leadership in addressing the situation. The government has been working with humanitarian partners, including the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the World Food Programme, and other agencies to alleviate the suffering of the people. We deeply appreciate the efforts of the Secretary General in this connection. The humanitarian access has been improving progressively with more convoys reaching the areas in need. This is demonstrated by the statistics provided by OCHA and WFP. The communication and coordination between the Ethiopian authorities and humanitarian agencies has improved significantly in recent weeks. We welcome the establishment of a regional emergency coordination center in Semera, comprising federal institutions, regional counterparts, WFP, and UN OCHA to facilitate the movement of trucks along Afar routes to Tigray and to coordinate emergency assistance to displaced people. we urge sustained close coordination between humanitarian agencies and the Ethiopian authorities to bridge the remaining gaps. At the same time, there is an urgent need to scale up efforts consistent with UN guiding principles for humanitarian assistance. At this juncture, Ethiopia needs all the support it can get from the international community. The international community should come together, treat the emerging situation with sensitivity and seriousness, and extend all possible humanitarian assistance to Ethiopia. The humanitarian agencies also need to take measures to avoid diversion of humanitarian aid. The government has undertaken investigation into cases of serious human rights violations, including through joint investigations with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We strongly denounce and condemn all atrocities committed by armed groups against civilians, including children. Those responsible for human rights violations and sexual violence perpetrated in Tigray should be prosecuted. For decades, Ethiopia has been an engine of economic growth in the Horn of Africa region. Today, Ethiopia needs support from the international community, including from the African Union and the United Nations, to address issues related to the conflict. The solution to the conflict must be Ethiopian-led and within the constitutional framework of Ethiopia. India continues to underscore the importance of mutual trust, engagement, dialogue, and reconciliation for lasting peace and stability. India reiterates its strong commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Ethiopia. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you for allowing my country's participation in this meeting. I thank the Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his briefing, and I acknowledge the presence of Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths. Mr. President, on the World Humanitarian Day last week, the Secretary General provided emphasis to the situation in my country. The government of Ethiopia appreciates the good faith engagement by the Secretary General. We appreciate the Secretary General call for ending the suffering of the Ethiopian people. This same objective will continue to drive the efforts of the government of Ethiopia, as was the case in the past 9 months following the treasonous and unforgettable attack against the Northern Command of the Ethiopian National Defense Force by TPLF. Excellencies, in previous discussion on the situation of my country, I tried to give a broader perspective on the problem where we are facing. The current state of affairs in Ethiopia did not transpire overnight. They were in the making long before the TPLF unleashed attack on the Northern Command of the NDF in the dark hours of November 4. The genesis of the current conflict goes back at least 3 decades ago. Since 1991, TPLF maintained hegemonic control over the political, security, and economic life of the Ethiopian people. During this time, the TPLF faced resistance at every turn in all corners of Ethiopia. We must recall that it was sustained popular protest that dislodged the TPLF from the political power in 2018, ushering in a promising period of transition. TPLF was dispelled not only from power, but also from the hearts and minds of Ethiopian people due to the non-evolving and destructive ideology it seeks to preserve in the Ethiopian body politic. The people of Ethiopia outprogressed this political elite that stand vanguard for division over unity, oligarchy over equal opportunity, favoritism over merit. When it lost power, the TPLF retreated to Tigray, taking our people in Tigray as hostage, because as the saying goes, for those accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. Still, despite numerous provocations, the Ethiopian government exercised maximum restraint until the group attacked and looted military barracks. Over the last 9 months, the government sought to uphold the constitutional order. The TPLF refused to disarm and surrender to law enforcement authorities, doubling down on its destructive agenda. Mr. President, the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire declared in June and the subsequent withdrawal of the National Defense Force from Tigray was supposed to bring calm to the region and its people and provide space for the TPLF leadership to reconsider its ruinous course. Our plan was to allow a peaceful farming season in Tigray. It was supposed to pave the way for the uninhibited flow of humanitarian assistance for the people in need. If it went according to our plan and vision, the ceasefire would have allowed us to embark on rebuilding and reconstruction in the region, and the repair and reconnection of infrastructure and economic apparatus disrupted by the TPLF. Also, children in Tigray would have already begun preparation for the 2014 school year. It is 2014 in Ethiopia, it is 2020 in the Gregorian calendar. That is set to begin next September. We had also wished for members of the TPLF that showed signals of willingness for peace to successfully advance their position and convince their peers to abide by the law and follow the path of peace. The government's commitment for peace was given no regard by the TPLF, who called the ceasefire a joke, and also by members of the international community that tolerated, enabled, and condemned the group to follow its destructive path. The repeated plea for ceasefire was ignored, and we now have Ethiopian children in Tigray subjected to forced recruitment to serve as cannon fodders. We also see aid distribution conditioned to parents giving away their children to war. Not only farmers in the Tigray region, but also those in adjacent Afar and Amhara region are now unable to farm their land, exposing them to the indigeneity of receiving aid to sustain their family. Hundreds of thousands in Afar and Amhara region are displaced and have sustained irreparable damage for their well-being. In absolute disregard for the well-being of people and in greedy pursuit, whatever is there to be acquired by creating mayhem on the very people it purports to stand for, TPLF blocked humanitarian aid. The group also engaged in formalization of fronts between internal and external actors bent on destabilizing the great nation that is Ethiopia. In this regard, we see a clear coordination between these internal treasonous elements and external actors from near and afar that have opened a multidimensional offensive to obstruct Ethiopia's right to use its natural resources. Mr. President, as to humanitarian assistance, the government of Ethiopia is fully cognizant of its obligation to its citizens. Sensationalization and politicization of our situation doesn't inform our response. We will continue to deliver on our obligation using all means and allocating all available resources. In this regard, the government of Ethiopia, first, is committed to hastening clearance of humanitarian convoys. In fact, we are committed to reducing the number of checkpoints and to fast-track scanning process. We are working with partners to introduce modern scanning technology. Second, we'll continue to consider requests for humanitarian flights. World Food Program and the National Disaster Risk Management Commission are administrating their humanitarian flights with no impediment. Third, we'll continue to provide cash and manage it in a predictable and sustainable manner for all humanitarian agencies. Similarly, the resumption of public service requires peace and rule of law in Tigray. These essential services cannot be reconnected while the group that to date killed 33 infrastructure operators and engineers, looted aid, diverted aid, and confiscated humanitarian convoys continues to persist on its destructive path of war. Mr. President, our goal is peace. Unfortunately, the TPLF is standing between Ethiopia and peace. TPLF is not the victim, it is the culprit. The people of Ethiopia, especially those in Afar, Amhara, and Tigray region, are living under undeserved and insufferable conditions. We are startled by everyone that appears to have been calling for peace and pressure the government for suspension of its law enforcement operation, to later on tolerate and ratify through their reticence the expansion of violence and mayhem by the TPLF. Our plea to all, with a sincere wish to help us realize peace, is to put pressure on this lawless group to stop its criminal advance, to abandon preparation for combat and abide by the laws of the country. The group must also irrefutably delink itself from internal and external sponsors and affiliates. As to the international community, we ask you to remove the actual or perceived support emanating from your side that this group feeds off. It has to only comply with the requirements set by the government and free the people of Tigray from its egoistically grip. Absent compliance with the laws of the country, the government of Ethiopia will apply and any means necessary to ensure law and order. Regarding some of the unsubstantiated assertions we heard today, we call upon members of the Council to be cautious about facts and misinformation that has dominated the scene. There is no discrimination based on any ground, including ethnicity, religious, or any other background. We are not people with less moral. We are people of values. We survived for centuries through social cohesion. We built unity while honoring differences. The Ethiopian reform is all about how to strengthen our unity and live in harmony. The reform is not to learn to die through ethnic divisions, as has been professed, propagated, and implemented by TPLF for over 30 years. Mr. President, I would like to use this opportunity to express our gratitude for all of you who stood with us in times of our need. At the same time, we respectfully assert our sovereign integrity as an ancient, independent African country on a constant strive to overcome its challenges. In this regard, I would like to underscore the severe mentality that seeks to undermine the sovereign right and responsibility of states of their own security and well-being of their people have proven harmful in very many instances. We only hope the right lesson are learned. Evidently, Ethiopia is not a country that allows delegating the shaping of its future. The international community has witnessed undue foreign pressure and interference is not appreciated by a soul in my country. And after the fact, regret, and admission of failure in foreign policy will not help. Hence, we call on everyone concerned to work with us. We are ready to work with all well-intentioned partners. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Ethiopia for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers.